All right, good morning, Ridge Point Church. How you doing this morning? Good. We're excited you're here as we're kicking off a brand new series this morning where we're talking about this idea of making change. I'm really excited about this series. Before we get into that, though, I just want to share a little bit of a story to lean into this just a little bit this morning. This past weekend, I had a chance to go out. We actually had a big wedding. I was a former youth pastor at another church, and one of the students in the youth group grew up, and she was getting married. It was a big wedding, and a lot of old friends and family were there. And a couple of the guys that were coming to that wedding in particular were big-time avid golfers, guys that I've kind of kept the relationship up and have golfed with them a lot in the past. And I'm not a golfer. I'm kind of an athlete that tries to golf, and I'm a hack at golfing. These guys are legitimately golfers. So I knew going into it. Can anybody else identify, if you go out on a golf course, you know that you're a hacker, but you're going to try, identify with me for a second. So I know that I'm within a crowd of friends. Because that's how I felt. I was with a couple of guys who really knew what they're doing, like they're drawing the ball on purpose, and I'm like, it kind of goes wherever it wants to go. But I got out there in the first couple holes, I was actually doing pretty well, which is really unlike me. But the first couple holes, I was 5 holes in. I was leading against these guys who were much better than I. And in particular, the second hole I got up, and it was a rather lengthy par 3, which means if you're really good, you can get up on the green in one shot. And so I pulled out my 4-iron, which typically I'm not a great player with that club, but I hit that really good on Friday. And so I pulled out my 4-iron. I hit it about 170 or 180 yards. I hit this shot that amazingly enough lands 6 feet from the pin. Like, it's probably the best golf shot I've ever hit. In fact, when I was done, I said, I should just quit now, forget the putt, because I'm probably going to miss it anyway, and just go home. I'm just going to retire right now because I'm never going to hit a shot like that again in my life. And by later on in the day, I realized that was the case because I came to a very, some of y'all are laughing at me right now. Thanks, I appreciate the encouragement. I came to a very similar style hole. I pull out the same club, take what feels like the very same swing, and I just like slice it off to the left, and I duff it, and it goes out of bounds, and I lose strokes because of it. When it comes to this particular series and what we're talking about this idea of making change, which eventually is going to get to be this talk about how we deal with our finances, which some people right away look at that and say, man, I'm not sure if that's something that you talk about in church. It seems like church is always talking about it. That's not the case at all. We'll get to that. But when it comes to the series, some people, as soon as we talk about, man, we're talking about a way to find freedom when it comes to this stressor in life that's known as finances. For some of us, we're going to sit on the edge of our seat, and we're going to say, man, I have so much to learn when it comes to this topic that I want to make sure that I get this right. And so for some of us, we're going to be on the edge of our seat saying, I want to not just learn these principles, but instill these principles into my life to make sure that I do this right. And others are going to come to this and say, that's not even spiritual. I don't need that. And we're going to shank this series to the left, and we're going to think, that must be for somebody else. I don't see the practical application of this. I don't see why this is spiritual. Because there's some people who think this idea that, well, all the church ever does is they talk about money. And I would just say, look at our track record for a second. It's not something we talk about on a regular basis. In fact, from the time that I've been here for the last 4 or 5 years, we've never done a full series on finances. This is the first time we've done something like this. But it's also something I don't think we should shy away from. Because Jesus himself spent a lot of time, an inordinate amount of time, talking about this idea of finances. He talked about it for a couple of reasons. First of all, he knew that inevitably that what our passions are directly tied to the way that we use our money. In fact, because we're in church, if I were to ask you right now to take out a pen and paper and to write down what are the biggest priorities in our life, if I were to say write down the top 3 or 4 things that are really the priority to you, because we're in church, we probably start off looking something like this. So I believe that my relationship with God is most important, then my relationship with my family, and then somewhere down there, there's like work and church and all these different things. But we'd say those things are valuable. I'm convinced that sometimes the things that we say and the things that we intend are not actually the things that we follow through with. And so when we say these are our priorities, I can look at a couple of things in my life, and if those things were open to me in your life, I could look at those and say, even though we say and we intend for these things to be the priority, these things are actually the priority. And there's 2 things I'd look at. How do we spend our time, and how do we spend our money? See, Jesus knew that inevitably the way that we spend our finances is going to be closely tied to what really is our passion. And the way that we spend our time is going to be closely tied to what is really the thing that drives us as a human being, what are the things that drive us as a church. And so Jesus says, because I know these two things are inevitably linked, I'm going to spend a lot of time. In fact, Jesus spends just about 500 verses talking about things like faith and topics like prayer. But he spends 2,000 verses talking about finances. Because he knew, number one, that it was going to be closely tied to our passions, but he also realized this, and this is so important, that when it comes to things in life that have a tendency to clutter it up, that this is one of those items that if we mess up, it can reduce the peace in our life. It can bring angst and turmoil and this conflict that's in our life. And he says, because of that, because I know that for my children, this is going to be one of the things that as they start to have discussions, as young people start to get married and they start to try to figure out what a budget looks like, that this is one of those things that's going to lead to some conflict in the relationship if they don't figure this out. And it also, if there's not a peace in their life at some point, their inability to understand finances in their life is ultimately going to affect their relationship with me. And we look at that and we say, it doesn't seem like it's that big a deal, because most of us want to have freedom. We want to have just the ability to be able to be truly free. In fact, everybody say this with me. Say, I want to be free. We didn't sound very free when we said that. Say it like this. Say, I want to be free. Much better. We want to be free, but the problem is that we keep making choices that put us back in either this mindset or circumstances where we put ourselves back, where we're restricting ourselves from truly being free. And it doesn't just affect our finances. It affects our relationship with others. And ultimately, it affects our relationship with God, because if you and I are walking around with the burden just like weighing on our shoulders of saying, man, I've tried to figure this stuff out, but this is so just burdensome to me right now. I'm worried all the time. It inevitably affects the relationship, and we say, man, we have to make sure that we get this right. And so we're going to lean into this idea because we're going to begin a 4-week series called Making Change, where we tackle 4 topics. The first topic is this one. The first topic is less is more. The second topic is stress is bad. The third topic, week 3, we'll talk about giving is good. And then the fourth topic is tomorrow matters. Everyone repeat after me. Say, less is more. Less is more. Stress is bad. Stress is bad. Giving is good. Tomorrow matters. Now let's say those collectively together. Less is more. Stress is bad. Giving is good. Tomorrow matters. We're going to drill down on those things. My prayer is that if you get nothing else, that at least by repetition we get these ideas down, to realize that as we launch into this series, that we get this idea that less is more, that stress is really, really bad for us, that giving is good, and that tomorrow matters. We want to make sure that we get those topics correct, because I'm convinced most of us just generally in life, we want to be able to do life better. And not just when it comes to finances, because this is a financial series, but there are practical implications that affect a lot other areas of our life. For some of us, we realize the reason, let's look at something that's a little bit easier to quantify. If we look at our physical health, there are some of us today that have goals out in front of us of some things that we'd like to accomplish. Some of us this morning would be like, man, I wish right now I was in enough shape that I could go out the doors of Ridge Point Church this morning and go out and run a 5K. That's 3.1 miles. How many of you, if you're in optimal physical shape, would love to be able to run a 5K this morning? Like, that'd be an awesome thing. I'd love to be able to do that. For others, they say, I'm kind of at that level. I want to run a half marathon, which is 13.1 miles. Some people look at that and say, I get tired driving 13.1 miles. Why would I want to run that far? That doesn't make sense to me. But whatever our physical goals are, we realize that we're in the boat that we're in now. Though some people are ready to do that. Some people right now could run that 5K. But for others, they say, that's a dream I'd love to be able to do. But the reason why I'm not there is because the last 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, I have made a series of decisions that have led me to where I am today. So back 15 years ago, if I would have dropped the hamburger and picked up a salad, Or if instead of sitting down and watching football on Sunday afternoon, I actually participated in playing football. If there's some physical exertion, if I made better health choices when it came to the things that I ate, I'd probably be in better shape to be able to do some of those things that I want to be able to do right now. And we get that when it comes to kind of being frustrated with our past. I say, man, I wish at 25 and 30 years old I was making some of those choices so that today I was better equipped to be able to do some of those things. But what we don't realize right now is right now we're setting the trend so that ourselves 15 years from now, that whatever we're doing now is going to affect ourselves in 15 years the same way that we feel now about ourselves 15 years ago. And so this series is predicated upon the idea that all of us, we want to experience freedom. But to experience freedom in the future requires making change today. Now, that can be a physical thing. That can be a spiritual thing. We want to be a certain spot spiritually, but we're not there now, but we have to put in the investment now so that 5 or 10 years from now, that we're in a better spot to be able to be spiritually mature and growing in our faith. It would be great if I could say, hey, here's some practical advice when it comes to our finances. And we're going to talk for 4 weeks, and I'd love to be able to do this where we talk for 4 weeks. I give you practical advice and say by the end of the 4th week, you're going to walk out of here debt-free. But it doesn't work that way. Like there's not a rapid influx of cash coming, at least that I'm aware of. But we want to instill principles that say if we truly want to be free in the future, it requires you and I reassessing everything and making changes today. That's why I believe that this idea, the passages we're going to talk about from both the Old and New Testament, the things we're going to look at, why Jesus spent so much time talking about finances, is because he realized this was going to become a big deal to us. And this isn't just a series about giving. People get critical of the church and say, all you do is talk about money because you want people to give, and that's not the point at all. In fact, very little time at all is going to be spent on that topic. Though we believe that giving is good, very little spent on that topic. More is just, man, Jesus wants us to live freely. And for most of us, I love being able to sit down with couples as they're getting ready to get married. And as we go through that counseling, as we're talking through, we do 3 different weeks of counseling. And in one of those weeks, we talk about finances and developing budgets and figuring out what's important. And I love being able to have those conversations because at least the first few years of marriage, the number 2 source of conflict is going to be their finances. And most people come into marriage and they come into life without really having a plan. And they just figured out, I know what my bank account looks like, and so my budget is built upon my bank account. And there's money in the bank account today, so I must be okay. And then it comes the next week, and my bills are higher than my income, and all of a sudden I'm out of balance. So it is about developing a budget, but it's actually about much, much more than that. It's figuring out what's really important. And that begins with this discussion about this idea of less is more, because we have a tendency, I think, especially as an American, this consumer culture we live in, we have a tendency more and more, especially over the last 50 years, to mix these two. In fact, we have a chart here that shows over the last 50 years the changes to the way that we spend and save money. In the last 50 years, so from 1968 to 2018, our debt-to-income ratio has increased dramatically at the same time that our personal savings rate has decreased just as rapidly. So as our debt is increasing, our savings is decreasing, and we start to realize that that's why we have so much stress when it comes to this topic. And we can't live freely in Christ. We can't live holy in our relationships because that stress is there. The average American, 57% of all Americans today have less than $1,000 in their savings account. And so what happens when they don't have that money in that savings account is an emergency happens and their car breaks down and they say, I don't know where to turn. I can't get my car fixed. So either I drive around, I don't have a car, I have to Uber it to work or whatever the case may be, or I go into debt and eventually I'll pay it off. And our habits don't change. We don't develop a savings plan after that. And so I already have $1,000 on the credit card and I'm not paying that off very quickly and I consume more debt and eventually it gets out of control. Because we never change our habits. So this series is all about making change and how do we take the necessary steps. Years ago, I was a youth pastor, and I was teaching on this topic, and I was teaching it was a different church. It was actually a church in a fairly affluent community, and we had a lot of successful business leaders that were in the crowd that morning, and I was teaching, and I made this statement. I said, for everybody who's here, or for most everybody who's here, we are all one or two terrible mistakes away from everything falling apart and us being bankrupt and us not knowing where to turn. And I remember looking around and saying, there's probably a couple people who take exception to that. And one of those guys that I knew fairly well, he's a very successful businessman, very godly guy, called me up and said, can we go out to lunch? I said, yeah, I'd love to. And I'm like, man, he's going to call me out because this guy's really well off, and he knows what he's doing. He's been this business owner for a long time. He's been incredibly successful. And he started talking. He said, man, when you said that, what you said, I realized that that's even true for me. And that for any one of us, if we make some bad choices when it comes to our relationships, if we make bad choices when it comes to our finances, we're only one or two bad decisions away because we've had this past track record of making some fairly sketchy decisions when it comes to our finances, and then we think, man, I want freedom, but I'm living on this past of some pretty bad decisions. So right now we're in this process of saying, how do we figure out this idea of less is more? If you have your Bibles, open up to Ecclesiastes chapter 4. We're just going to read 3 verses this morning. And in Ecclesiastes, and we're going to drive down deep into this topic of less is more. But in Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes is Solomon, who's the wisest man who ever lived. He's writing, as he writes in Proverbs, he's writing. And often in Proverbs, he writes as a father would write to his son. And he wants to impart wisdom. God has said, I'm going to give you everything that you want. And Solomon asks for wisdom. And because of that, God blesses him in a variety of areas. And one of the areas he blesses him in is finances. And he does really, really well financially. And so he says, I want to impart my wisdom to my son. I want to take some lessons that I've learned, and I want to pass that down to him. So Proverbs, a lot of Proverbs is like that. Ecclesiastes takes a little bit different turn. Some will look at Ecclesiastes and say it's negative, it's a little bit depressing, because Solomon says things like, vanity of vanities, all of this is vanity. He said, I've been doing all these things. I've been chasing after all these things. And all of it is vanity. And he keeps using this phrase that it's like chasing the wind. That some of our pursuits in life are like chasing the wind. It's like we try to catch the wind, but that task is futile. He said it's impossible for us to do that. And yet the things that we pursue in life often are like trying to catch the wind, where the task itself is futile. So in Ecclesiastes 4, we read into this passage where Solomon is writing. He's talking about some of the tasks we have that are impossible. And he says this, then I saw that all toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and is striving after the wind. The fool folds his hand and eats his own flesh. And he says this, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and striving after the wind. Twice in 3 verses, he uses this phrase about the things that we're doing are like striving after wind. So when we start to talk about this idea of less is more, we say, well, it kind of flies directly in the face of everything we've kind of learned as an American culture, because we've always been taught that the American dream is more is more. That why have 1 if it's possible for you to have 2? And why have 2 if you could have 5? And why have 5 if you could have 10? Because we have been taught this idea. It's been ingrained inside of us that more is more. That more is better and bigger is better. And so we pursue all of those things. We always want to have bigger and we want to have better. And we say, if I could just have this. And so Solomon writing says, let me explain this to you. That the competition that we have with our neighbors, go back to verse 4, it says this, all the toil and all the skill and work comes from a man's envy of his neighbor. So I look over at my neighbor, and he has some of the things that I don't have. I notice the things that he has that I don't have. I don't always notice the things that I have that he doesn't. So I look at my neighbor and I say, man, his grass, it always looks really nice. I wish my grass looked like that. I wish I had his car or his house, or I wish I had his countertops, or whatever it is that he has that I don't have. We start to be in competition with them, and we say we have to live up to a certain standard. And Solomon says, as long as that's our driving motivation, that all the toil and all the work that we do comes from a man's envy of his neighbor. And as long as you do that, it's like chasing after the wind. I just want to give us two takeaways as we talk about this passage this morning. The first takeaway, focusing on verse 4, is that I've bought into the lie that I deserve something simply because I can afford it. See, as we start to grow, as our ability to earn income increases, and as we get older, we start to look around and say, well, I can afford that now. I couldn't afford that before. I can afford it now, so simply because I can afford it, now I deserve it. See, life works this way. When we're young, maybe you got your first job in high school. You want to learn a little bit of extra spending money. Now, your potential to earn income at that point is really, really low. It's represented by this dollar. My first job that I got was working at Publix as a part-time bagger and eventually as a part-time stock person. Now, I wasn't making a lot of money. In fact, at that point, our money is we always explain how much we make by how much we make per hour. And our hours shift quite a bit at that age. But the thing was, when I was making the least amount of money in my life, I also had the least amount of responsibility. And if I really got in an emergency where I was out of money for gas, which is probably my biggest responsibility, I could always turn to mom or dad as option A. And so when I was working at Publix, my paycheck was probably somewhere between $130 and $190 a week. It was probably the average paycheck. But at that time, I had very little responsibility. So I remember going to Publix on a Thursday and picking up my check and then going to the counter and casting the check and writing my name on it and giving it over. And they give me my money right at the counter. And all of a sudden, as a 17-year-old, I had $190 in my pocket. And I felt really rich for the first and last time. Because at that point, there was margin between what I was making and what my expenses were. Now, I wasn't making a whole lot. But my responsibility was put $20 worth of gas in your car every week, and you're pretty good. You're still living at home. You don't have rent. You don't have to buy food. Mom and dad are taking care of all those things. And so because of that, really at 17 years old, though I didn't make a lot of money, there was a lot of financial margin percentage-wise compared to where we get later on in life. But when we're here, we dream of bigger and better things. And so we graduate high school, maybe go into college or trade school or move into the workforce. And because of that, our ability to make money grows exponentially. I moved from a potential earning of $1 now to potential earnings of $5. And it feels liberating, like my paycheck looks a lot bigger than it used to working part-time at Publix. But with that, there starts to be responsibility. I move out and making it on my own. I got to pay rent and I got to pay some electricity. And eventually maybe in this life spot, we're in the early 20s, we start thinking about marriage. And though we're making more money, we're also spending more money. Our responsibilities are getting higher. In fact, when we started, there was a lot of margin between what we were making up here and what we were spending because our expenditures were really, really low. At this point, if I wanted to go out and buy, because I played a lot of basketball, if I wanted to go out and buy a new pair of basketball shoes, that was nothing. But I get to this point, responsibility is higher. And though I'm earning a lot more money, my responsibilities are creeping up. And now I start to have to learn to think about things like budgeting. Trying to figure out what's really essential, what's really important. Even though I'm getting more money, my expenses are getting higher. And the stress is starting to become a little bit of an edge in the way that I think. It's starting to become a worry. And if I'm married, it starts to become a little bit of friction in that relationship. But we keep dreaming of bigger and better things. We move into our 30s. Our potential to earn income is much, much higher again. It grows, maybe even it doubles, represented by the $10 bill. And I get to that point and I start to think, well, I was already paying for rent and I was already paying for utilities and insurance, all those things that are adult things to do. I know that I'm in my 30s and there's other things that are coming. Like at this point, maybe marriage is a reality and we're talking about kids. Like I know there's some more expenses, but I'm making a lot more money than I ever dreamed that I'd be able to make. Like I should feel some financial freedom right now. And yet I don't. Because there's not any margin. As we increase our income, we're increasing our expenses sometimes. Now, some of it happens naturally, some of it organically. You're going to have increased expenses as you start to add family and get older, all those things. But some of it is that when I get to this point, I'm getting the promotions at work. I feel like there's a certain level of lifestyle I should be living up to. There's a way that I have to dress the part when I walk in the office, and so my expenses are higher. I want to make sure that when I pull up that I'm driving a car that's equivalent to the other cars in a parking lot. And so for the first time, maybe I'm thinking about taking out a car loan to take care of those things. And we increase our expenses. And at this point, we become really in danger of increasing our expenses at a more rapid clip than we're increasing our income. And all of a sudden, we start to feel this financial strain. Because back here, if I got in a little bit of trouble, it wasn't that big a deal. I could work myself out. But now the bills are really real and they're getting higher, and we start to feel this financial strain that starts to take away our freedom. Because we're starting to learn this idea that freedom is often found in the margins. That the difference between my income and my expenses, that as that margin in between, as that margin decreases, with it my freedom decreases. In fact, I saw a study earlier this week that said that as the average American, as we start to increase our expenses, as we start to increase our incomes, our expenses, our real fixed expenses, don't increase as rapidly. Like there should be more margin. At some point, there should be tens of thousands of dollars of margin between what we're making and what we're spending in essential expenses. But there's a secondary expense that they discovered. Going from things that we need to things that we want, there's a secondary expense in the middle that isn't really a need, but it's a little bit greater than just a want. And it's what we kind of feel like is necessary for us just to be able to do life like everybody else. Things like going out to eat and doing things that are nice, but we just say, man, I feel like just to live up to what everybody else is doing, I have to do that. And by the time we factor in those necessary expenses plus these intermediate expenses that aren't wants, but they're not exactly needs, that many Americans are left to live not per month, not per week, but per year. The average American, or many Americans are left living on $367 extra margin a year, which is equivalent to about $1 a day. Like that's the margin we have for many Americans today. And that's why we start to feel the stress, is because we thought by the time I got to this point, I'd have margin, I'd feel more freedom, and the more money I make, the more money I expend and is going out. And we get to this point, we start to think about, man, when I was back here and I was making nothing, I could make ends meet. Now I'm up here and my expenses have increased so much. What would happen if I could live on this income but still live on this expense? The margin that would be there would give me so much freedom. Because in margin is often where we start to discover freedom. That's why if you're to wake up and you're to put on a pair of jeans that you just got out of the dryer, and as you pull on these pair of jeans just out of the dryer, you reach in the pocket and you feel that crisp dollar feel in your pocket. It doesn't matter how old we are. It doesn't matter what our position is in life, how much money we have. We reach in and we're like, oh, I hope that's more than $1. Because I know what my budget is. I know how much is in my bank account. And I know that I have budgeted for all that. But when I reach in and that's a 5 or 10, or praise God if it's a 20. Man, now I got money to spend this week that's like free money. And that's why for every one of us, like that gives us freedom, makes us feel good, because our budget is so tight often. By the time we get to what experts tell us is the prime time for us to our highest potential earning is in our 40s to 60s. Now, the truth is that despite what some experts say, is that most people, when they hit that prime time of being able to have some margin, they've actually figured out a little bit how to create some space. And that during that time, there is a little bit more margin, but they're beginning to think about things like, well, if I want to retire, I probably should start investing. And had I learned some of these principles way back here, I'd be living in a lot more financial freedom. And so even though there's more margin, there's also some different responsibilities, and the conversation changes. And so the stress never actually goes away. To the point that no matter how much we've made through the years, for a lot of us, this is the margin that we have. Now we can look at that and we can say, like I get that. There's some great practical advice that's there. But how is that also a spiritual thing? Because this is just practical. It's talking about freedom, I guess, a little bit, but it's practical. But here's an even greater lesson. The second part of this discussion in verse 6. Verse 6 again says this. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and striving after wind. The second truth is that when I have less things that are important, it leaves margin for the things that are. When I have less of things that aren't important, it leaves margin for the things that are. Solomon here is writing, he says, better is a handful of quietness, 1 handful of quietness, than 2 hands full of toil and worry and stress and anxiety. Because we're so busy chasing after these things, we want all these things, that we fill our life up with all of these things. And he says, man, it'd be better not to fill your life up with those things, but hold on to 1 handful of quietness and the other hand that's free. See, if I have 1 handful of stuff, my other hand is free, then I see a brother who's hurting, and I can reach down and lift them up. If I have 1 hand that's full and 1 hand that's free, when I get tired, I can rest. But we fill both hands up with stuff, and then we say, man, I'd like to be able to do more. I'd like to be able to help someone out, but both hands are full, and with clutter comes confusion. Be honest for a second. How many of you have ever walked into a room that is just an absolute mess? Like there's stuff all over. And you walk in and you just can't relax because of all the clutter. Can anybody identify with that? Like it just is frustrating. I like walking in and things being orderly and clean, and it just makes me feel better. When our life is disorganized, when our life is chaotic, it affects our relationship with others. And affects our relationship with God. That's true when it comes to physical things, but it's also true when it comes to financial things. That when there's clutter, when I walk into my office, and there's stuff around my office of stuff that we've been doing, and I want to connect with God, I feel like, man, God, I want to be there, but all this stuff is really stressing me out. Let me clear this stuff out. But we do that in our life. We fill stuff up. In fact, our houses have started to replicate that in our life because many of us, when homes were built 100 years ago, the closets were really, really small. But now our wardrobe has increased and our other stuff has increased. And so today we have walk-in closets and we have walk-around closets. And our closets are so full of stuff that we run out of room in the closets and we got to take it to the garage. And we go to the garage, which is where we're supposed to go to park our car, and our garages are so full of stuff that nothing, how many of y'all will recognize that my car cannot fit in my garage because I got too much stuff in my garage? Like a lot of us. So our garage is full of stuff because we keep accumulating stuff, and eventually that gets so full that we say we have to move some of this stuff because I need more room in my garage to put more stuff. So we put stuff up in our attic. I've not gotten to this point in my life yet. I'm getting there. But we're going to put stuff up in our attic. And then eventually our attics are so full, we say we're out of room. So let's go rent a separate house just for our stuff. And we go and we rent this house full of, just to put our stuff. Now, I've not gotten to this point in my life yet either. But growing up, I had family members that did. And I would go with them every year around Christmas time. Because mostly what they stored in these units was like seasonal stuff that they don't use throughout the year, but they wanted at special times, like Christmas decorations. And so I remember riding to family members' storage units and going and pulling this stuff out. So I did research. And I found out that the average today, the average storage unit that's 10 feet by 15 feet, climate-controlled storage is $115 to $150 a month. So I just did some quick math just to figure this whole thing out. And I said, okay, let's say that it was at the high end, but we only were paying for 10 months just to get an even number. So let's say $150 a month times 10 months is $1,500. And I said, if I'm spending $1,500 just to store my Christmas items, I would be better off at the end of the year tearing down all my lights, throwing it all away, and the next year being able to start all over, and I wouldn't have to test a light ever again. And I'd still end up financially being positive. Now, if that's you, I'm not judging you. Don't take that at all. Oftentimes we use that for sentimental things and other things. But I'm saying sometimes we make decisions based on what seems convenient now. And we're cluttering up our life. And we're filling our life with more stuff that doesn't matter and less of what does. And so less is more is predicated upon this idea that less of stuff that doesn't matter leaves more margin for the things that do. Each week we're going to try to give you some takeaways, some things to say, man, if we want to grow in this area, what are one or two things that we can take away to help us fix this in our life? Because we can't change things in 4 weeks. But we can lay some foundations to fix things for 15 years from now. I think budgeting is important. If you're not doing that, it's something I'd recommend you do. Obviously, Chris is going to talk in just a second about Financial Peace University. I think that's an important step as well. But I think way before we ever get to budgeting, we have to figure out what's really important. See, what I say are my priorities and what actually are my priorities are two different things. So 2 takeaways, 2 things I want to challenge you to do this week is, number one, is to have a conversation. If you live by your own, if you're the only one in control of your finances, then have a conversation, you and God. If you live with a spouse, have a conversation with your spouse. If you have older kids, you want to be part of the conversation, include them in it as well. But have a conversation and say, as a family, maybe we've allowed chaos to come into our life, into our orderliness, even into our finances. Let's figure out what's important. And the second thing is declutter. Physically declutter. Here's the thing. There's this movement right now. There's this minimalist movement to get rid of stuff. And the driving factor behind it is that everybody who's here can afford in their life to get rid of 100 things in their car, office, or home. By the end of this year. Some people are really excited about that. So some of the wives are like, wait, what are you talking about? But here's the thing. I would challenge you this year, by the end of this year, to get rid of 100 things that you're no longer using. And it might be financial things. It might be, man, there's recurring expenses on your account. You're not even sure what it's going to anymore. Get rid of those things. You're throwing those things away. But there's stuff around your house. Yesterday, I got to wrap this up, but yesterday my wife and I were cleaning out one of our closets, and it was just a little bit, but now I walked in that closet. And I was walking in that closet, I'm like, man, I feel so much freer. Like sometimes just decluttering stuff in our life just gives us a freedom to have better relationships, but also it affects the relationship we have with God. So I challenge you 2 things. Have that conversation of what's important, and look to get rid of 100 things by the end of this year. Let's pray together. God, I believe fully that the conversation we're having this morning, even though there's a lot of practical elements to it as we talk about finances, God, that there's also a clear spiritual effect that this has upon us. God, I believe because of the clutter of life, whether it's stuff that we've messed up financially, whether it's stuff that we've just allowed to break into our life, God, for some of us this morning, it's the clutter of unhealthy relationships that has taken our eye off of you and on stress and worry and anxiety and fear that we face right here. God, for some of us this morning, we just have to remove physical clutter from our life. We have to clean things up. We have to organize things. We have to get out the vacuum. We have to get out the broom and the dustpan and just clean and organize physical aspects of our life. God, for others, this main series is about finances and fixing our finances. And God, for a lot of us, there's financial clutter that's ruining us right now. God, help us to get focused on what's really important and remove the clutter. But God, also for some this morning, there's spiritual clutter that's keeping them away from you. It's affecting their relationship with you because their life is full of stress and worry and anxiety and listening to the wrong voices and just being overall distracted. God, I pray in the stillness of this moment that we have a chance to block out that clutter and to connect with you. God, we thank you for your love, your mercy, your grace. We thank you for Jesus come here to earth to set us free of the clutter that even the effect of sin brings on our life. So God, I pray that today the freedom that Jesus brings us through his death and his resurrection is realized on a daily basis. We love you. Thank you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.